The night the paramedics found Leonard Hayes, the snow had already covered most of Cedar Ridge Road. His body lay half-slumped near the steps of a quiet suburban house, his coat stiff with frost and his breath so faint that one of the responders initially feared they were too late. The flashing ambulance lights reflected off the frozen pavement while a few curious neighbors watched from behind their windows, trying to piece together what had happened. Some assumed he had slipped on the icy sidewalk. Others thought he might have been a stranger who wandered into the wrong neighborhood. None of them realized that the 73-year-old man lying in the snow had come there believing he was arriving at his daughter's home for Christmas dinner. When Leonard finally regained consciousness hours later, the first thing he noticed was the sound of a heart monitor, steady and patient, echoing in the quiet hospital room. The ceiling lights were painfully bright, forcing him to blink several times before his vision steadied. His throat felt painfully dry, and every movement seemed to require more strength than he had left. A nurse leaned over him with a calm expression that suggested she had seen many mornings like this. "Mr. Hayes, can you hear me?" she asked gently. Leonard moved his head slightly. Even that small motion sent a dull ache through his body. She adjusted the blanket around his shoulders and spoke again, her voice low and reassuring. "You're at Green Valley Hospital. You were brought in early this morning. Someone found you outside in the cold." Leonard tried to speak but could barely manage a whisper. "How long?" The nurse paused before answering. "Several hours. You had severe hypothermia. Another hour out there," and she didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Leonard closed his eyes, letting the words settle. The memories were still distant, blurred by exhaustion and cold, but something about them felt heavy, like a truth waiting patiently to return. Later that afternoon, when the room had grown quiet again, Leonard noticed his phone resting on the bedside table. Someone had plugged it into charge, and the screen lit up as soon as he touched it. For a brief moment, a fragile hope stirred inside him. Perhaps there were missed calls. Perhaps Emily had realized he never made it home and had tried to reach him. After all, he had driven across the city just to spend the evening with her family. Slowly, carefully, he unlocked the screen and checked the notifications. There were none. No missed calls. No text messages.
No voicemail alerts.
Just the date displayed clearly across the top of the screen, December 25th, Christmas morning. Leonard stared at the empty screen longer than he meant to, his chest tightening with a quiet understanding that didn't require explanation. A doctor entered the room soon after, a tall man with tired eyes and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He explained Leonard's condition with careful professionalism, listing the effects of hypothermia and dehydration in a voice that sounded almost routine. "You're fortunate someone spotted you when they did," the doctor said. "A neighbor walking his dog noticed you near the porch and called emergency services." Leonard nodded slowly, though the word fortunate felt strangely hollow. Luck had nothing to do with why he had been sitting outside that house in the middle of the night. After the doctor left, the room returned to silence except for the quiet rhythm of the monitor beside his bed. Leonard stared at the pale ceiling and tried to understand how the evening had gone so wrong. Just 2 days earlier, he had believed this Christmas might finally be different. Leonard Hayes had spent most of his life working as a mechanic in a small repair shop on the edge of Dayton, Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work, but it had paid the bills and allowed him to raise his daughter after his wife passed away nearly 20 years ago. He had taken pride in providing for Emily, often working late nights and weekends to make sure she had everything she needed. Somewhere along the way, that habit of putting others first had simply become part of who he was. Even after Emily married and moved into a large house on the northern side of the city, Leonard continued helping whenever he could. Sometimes that meant fixing appliances, sometimes covering unexpected expenses when money was tight. He never complained. To him, helping his daughter felt natural, almost automatic. 3 days before Christmas, Emily had called him unexpectedly. Her voice sounded distracted but polite. "We're hosting Christmas Eve dinner this year," she said. "Daniel thinks it might be nice if you came by." The phrasing caught Leonard's attention. Daniel thinks, not Emily wants. Still, he told himself not to read too much into it. Invitations were invitations, and after several holidays spent alone, the idea of sitting at a crowded table with his grandchildren felt like a small miracle. That morning he woke early in his modest apartment and began preparing food the way he had when Emily was a child. He baked a cinnamon walnut cake she used to request every year, wrapping it carefully once it cooled. He packed containers of homemade mashed potatoes and roasted vegetables, telling himself that bringing food would make things easier for everyone. On his small kitchen table, he placed a few wrapped gifts he had purchased during the previous month: a warm scarf for Emily, a tool set for Daniel, and storybooks for the grandchildren. The total cost had been more than he could comfortably afford, but he had convinced himself it was worth it. Christmas, after all, was about family. By the time Leonard drove across the city that evening, the streets were glowing with holiday lights. Houses along Maplewood Avenue shimmered with decorations, and laughter spilled from open doors as families gathered inside. When Leonard finally parked outside Emily's house, he paused for a moment before stepping out of the car. Through the large living room windows, he could see silhouettes moving inside, glasses raised in celebration, and children running through the hallway. The house looked warm, bright, and full of life. He straightened his coat, picked up the containers of food and gifts from the passenger seat, and walked toward the front door with cautious optimism. The porch light illuminated the snowflakes drifting through the air, and for a brief moment Leonard allowed himself to imagine the evening unfolding exactly the way he hoped it would. He pictured Emily greeting him with a tired but genuine smile, the grandchildren rushing over to show him their new toys, and the entire family gathering around the dining table together. Hope, after all, has a quiet way of slipping back into the heart even after years of disappointment. Leonard rang the doorbell and waited, unaware that before the night ended, he would find himself sitting alone outside that very door, while the warmth he had come searching for remained just a few feet away on the other side. When the front door opened, Emily stood there holding a glass of wine, the warm light from the house glowing behind her like a stage. For a brief moment her expression froze, as if she hadn't expected to see him standing there so soon. Then a quick smile appeared on her face, polite and practiced, the kind people use when they are greeting someone they feel obligated to welcome rather than someone they are genuinely happy to see. "Dad," she said lightly, stepping aside just enough for him to enter. "You made it." Leonard nodded and carefully carried the containers of food inside, immediately feeling the difference between the bitter cold outside and the warm air filling the house. The smell of roasted meat, cinnamon, and expensive perfume hung in the hallway. Voices drifted from deeper inside the house where guests had already gathered. Laughter erupted somewhere near the dining room, followed by the clinking of glasses. Emily closed the door behind him quickly, almost as if she were trying to keep the noise contained. "Everyone's in the dining area," she said. "You can just set your things in the kitchen first." Leonard followed her through the hallway, passing coats neatly arranged on hooks and polished shoes lined along the wall. Everything looked carefully organized, the kind of order that suggested a house accustomed to entertaining guests who belonged there. The kitchen was bright and spotless, its white countertops nearly empty except for trays of elegant appetizers that looked untouched. Leonard placed his containers carefully beside them, adjusting the ribbon around the cake box the way he always did when bringing food somewhere special. The small gesture made him feel useful, like he was contributing something meaningful to the evening. "I brought a few things," he said quietly, "just in case you needed extra." Emily glanced at the containers, but didn't move closer to inspect them. "Oh, thanks," she replied quickly. Her attention was already drifting back toward the sounds of the party in the next room. Leonard cleared his throat slightly. "Is there anything I can help with?" he asked. Emily shook her head almost immediately. "No, everything's already under control. You should probably just relax." The words were simple enough, but something about the tone felt distant, almost rehearsed. Leonard nodded anyway and took a seat at the small kitchen table near the window. From there, he could hear the conversation in the dining room clearly. Guests were telling stories, laughing loudly, and occasionally applauding when someone finished speaking. One voice in particular rose above the others, Daniel's confident, easy laugh. Leonard waited patiently, assuming someone would eventually come into the kitchen to greet him. After all, it was his daughter's home, and surely she would introduce him to her friends. Minutes passed, stretching slowly. Emily moved around the kitchen occasionally, opening drawers, adjusting plates, checking her phone, but she never once suggested that Leonard join the others. Eventually, the smell of food from the dining room grew stronger, making Leonard realize he hadn't eaten anything all day. He had saved his appetite for this dinner, imagining the warm feeling of sitting with family around a crowded table. When the laughter suddenly grew louder and chairs scraped across the floor, he assumed dinner was about to begin. Leonard stood carefully, smoothing the front of his coat as he walked toward the dining room entrance. The moment he stepped into the doorway, the room fell strangely quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and a dozen unfamiliar faces turned to look at him at once. The long dining table was already set with plates and glasses, the centerpiece glowing softly under the chandelier above. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his arm resting comfortably along the back of Emily's chair. For a second, Leonard expected someone to wave him over, maybe offer a seat or introduce themselves. Instead, the silence stretched awkwardly. Emily looked up from her seat, her expression tightening slightly as if something unexpected had interrupted the evening. Daniel cleared his throat. "Oh," he said casually. "Leonard, right?" Leonard nodded. "I thought dinner was starting," he said quietly. Emily exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before responding. "Well, yes, but tonight is mostly for Daniel's co-workers and their families." She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. "It's a small gathering." Leonard felt a strange weight settle in his chest, though he couldn't fully explain why. "I understand," he said quickly. "I can sit anywhere. I don't mind." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair and gave a small shrug that seemed almost apologetic but carried no real concern. "The table's already full," he said. "We didn't really plan for extra guests." The word guests lingered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Leonard stood there for a moment longer, unsure what he was supposed to do. He looked at Emily again, waiting for some sign that she would correct the misunderstanding, maybe tell someone to bring another chair or suggest moving things around. Instead, she sighed quietly and pushed her chair back from the table. "Dad," she said gently, though her eyes remained distant. "Maybe it would be easier if you waited outside for a little while. We're almost done here, and then we can talk." The suggestion felt so unexpected that Leonard struggled to process it. "Outside," he repeated. "Just for a few minutes," Daniel added quickly, standing up as if to guide him toward the door. "We're right in the middle of dinner, and things are a bit crowded in here." Around a table, the guests avoided looking directly at him. Some stared down at their plates while others pretended to check their phones. No one objected. No one offered another solution. Emily had already walked toward the front hallway, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Leonard followed slowly, still carrying the quiet belief that this was simply an awkward misunderstanding that would soon resolve itself. When they reached the front door, Emily opened it, and the cold night air rushed in instantly, swirling snowflakes across the porch. "Just wait here for a little bit," she said. "Once dinner wraps up, we'll bring you back inside." Her voice was calm and reassuring, but there was a finality in it that Leonard didn't notice at the time. He stepped onto the porch, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders as the wind brushed against his face. For a split second, he thought Emily might follow him outside, perhaps to apologize or explain the situation more clearly. Instead, she remained standing in the doorway. "It won't be long," she added quickly. Then the door closed with a firm click that echoed into the quiet street. Leonard stood there under the porch light, staring at the wood panel in front of him while the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation resumed immediately inside the house. The music grew louder again. Glasses clinked together in a cheerful toast, and someone began telling another story that caused the entire room to erupt with laughter. It was as if the brief interruption had never happened. Leonard wrapped his arms around himself and tried to convince his mind that this was temporary. Just a few minutes, he told himself. Just until dinner ends. The snow continued falling gently around him while the warmth from inside remained only a few feet away on the other side of the locked door. At first, he waited patiently, shifting his weight from one foot to the other to stay warm. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The laughter inside never faded, and no one came to open the door. Eventually, Leonard reached for the handle and tried turning it gently. It didn't move. The door had been locked. The realization settled slowly into his chest, bringing with it a quiet confusion he didn't know how to name. He raised his hand and knocked once, softly at first, then again with more urgency. The sound disappeared into the music and conversation inside the house. No one answered. Leonard stepped back from the door, looking out at the empty street where the snow was beginning to gather on the pavement. Somewhere down the road, a car drove past slowly, its headlights sweeping across the houses before disappearing into the darkness. Leonard watched it vanish, then turned back toward the closed door. Inside that house, less than 10 feet away, his daughter and her guests were celebrating Christmas Eve together. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen for a moment before dialing Emily's number. The ringing seemed louder in the cold night air than it had any right to be. For a moment he believed she might answer quickly and laugh about the misunderstanding, inviting him back inside with an apology. Instead, the phone rang several times before the call finally connected.
Dad.
Emily's voice sounded distracted, as though she had stepped away from the table briefly. "I'm still outside," Leonard said quietly. "The door won't open." There was a pause long enough for him to hear voices behind her and the faint clatter of dishes. "We're in the middle of dinner," she replied after a moment. "Just give it a little time." Then the line went silent. Leonard remained on the porch long after the call ended, staring at the dark screen of his phone as if it might suddenly light up again with a different response. The snow continued falling, drifting quietly across the street and settling on the railing beside him. At first, he told himself Emily had simply been distracted. The house was full of guests, and hosting people could be stressful. He had hosted enough dinners in his life to understand that. Someone would come soon. Someone would remember he was outside. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and paced slowly across the narrow porch, rubbing his hands together to keep the warmth in his fingers. Through the door, he could still hear the muffled rhythm of conversation and laughter, a steady reminder that life inside the house continued comfortably without him. Every now and then a louder burst of laughter broke through the music, followed by the unmistakable clink of glasses being raised for another toast. Leonard imagined the long dining table filled with plates of food and smiling faces, the warm light from the chandelier reflecting off the polished wood. Just beyond that door was everything he had hoped to be part of that night. 10 more minutes passed, then another 15. The cold slowly began creeping through his coat and settling into his bones. The temperature had dropped sharply since sunset, and the wind carried a damp chill that made the air feel heavier than it should have. Leonard stepped closer to the door and knocked again, this time a little louder. The sound echoed briefly against the wood before disappearing beneath the music inside.
No footsteps approached.
No voices called out to him. He reached for the handle again and tried turning it, but it remained firmly locked. For a moment, he simply stood there with his hand resting against the cold metal, listening to the faint movement inside the house. The idea that no one might come back for him began to surface slowly, like a thought he didn't want to acknowledge. He stepped away from the door and leaned against the railing, looking out at the quiet street where snow had begun to blanket the pavement. Most of the houses nearby glowed warmly with Christmas lights. Through a few windows, he could see families gathered around their own tables, silhouettes moving as they talked and laughed together. The contrast made the porch feel colder somehow, emptier. Eventually, Leonard pulled his phone out again and dialed Emily once more. The call rang several times before switching to voicemail. He tried again, hoping she simply hadn't heard it the first time, but the result was the same. On the third attempt, he hesitated before pressing the call button, then lowered the phone slowly. Perhaps she had turned it off to focus on her guests. Perhaps she planned to come check on him once dinner finished. Leonard slipped the phone back into his pocket and began pacing again, trying to keep his blood moving. The snow had grown thicker now, dusting the shoulders of his coat and collecting along the edges of the porch. His breath appeared in small white clouds each time he exhaled. As the minutes stretched into nearly an hour, the warmth inside the house began to feel like a distant memory rather than something just a few feet away. Leonard tried knocking once more, harder this time, his knuckles striking the door with a dull thud. "Emily," he called softly. His voice sounded thin against the cold night air. No one responded. The music inside shifted to a new song, and the conversation continued, without interruption. The cold eventually forced him to stop pacing. His legs had begun to ache, and a deep stiffness settled into his joints that made movement slow and awkward. Leonard lowered himself carefully onto the wooden step beside the door, resting his back against the wall of the house. The wood felt cold even through his coat. He pulled his arms tightly around his chest, trying to trap what little warmth remained. As he sat there, memories began surfacing uninvited. He remembered Emily as a little girl sitting at the kitchen table coloring while he cooked dinner after work. He remembered carrying her on his shoulders through the county fair one summer when she had been too tired to walk. He remembered the long nights after his wife passed away when Emily had cried herself to sleep and he had stayed awake beside her bed, promising that everything would be all right. Those memories had always felt like proof that the sacrifices had meant something, that the years he spent raising her alone had built a bond strong enough to survive anything. Sitting on that porch now, listening to strangers laugh inside his daughter's home, Leonard felt those memories shift slightly, like photographs fading under harsh light. The cold began affecting him in ways he didn't immediately recognize. At first it was just a numbness spreading slowly through his fingers and toes. Then his thoughts started to feel oddly distant, as if they belonged to someone else. He tried standing again, but his legs refused to cooperate, forcing him to grip the railing for support before sinking back down onto the step. Snowflakes collected in his thinning gray hair and along the collar of his coat. The porch light above him flickered slightly in the wind, casting weak shadows across the quiet driveway. Leonard reached for his phone one more time, intending to call again, but his hands had grown stiff and clumsy. The screen blurred slightly when he tried focusing on it. For a moment, he considered walking down the street to find help, but the idea of moving even a few steps felt overwhelming. Instead, he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for just a second, telling himself he would rest before trying again. Hours later, a man named Carl Jennings stepped out of his house 2 doors down to take his dog outside before going to bed. The neighborhood had grown quiet by then, most of the lights inside nearby homes already dimmed for the night. As Carl walked toward the sidewalk, his dog suddenly pulled toward Emily's house, barking softly. At first, Carl assumed the animal had noticed a raccoon or another stray moving through the snow. Then he saw the shape near the porch steps. Under the dim glow of the porch light, a figure was slumped against the wall, partially covered in snow. Carl approached cautiously, calling out to see if the person was awake. When there was no response, he moved closer and realized the man was barely breathing. Panic rushed through him as he pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. Within minutes, the quiet street filled with the flashing lights of an ambulance and police cruiser. Paramedics rushed up the walkway carrying equipment while Carl stood nearby explaining what he had found. The responders quickly recognized the signs of severe hypothermia and began working to stabilize Leonard before carefully lifting him onto a stretcher. During the commotion, one of the paramedics knocked on Emily's front door several times. Eventually, Daniel opened it, confusion written across his face as he looked out at the flashing lights and the group gathered on the porch. When the paramedic asked if he knew the elderly man who had been found outside, Daniel hesitated before glancing back into the house. Guests were still visible inside, clearing dishes and finishing drinks as if the evening had just ended normally. Emily appeared beside him a moment later, her expression shifting from surprise to something harder to read as she recognized the figure on the stretcher. She stepped forward slowly, but said nothing while the paramedics loaded Leonard into the ambulance. The vehicle pulled away moments later, disappearing down the snowy street toward the hospital. Behind them, the neighborhood returned to its quiet routine, the flashing lights fading into the distance. By the time Leonard opened his eyes the next afternoon in the hospital, the events of the night felt distant and fragmented, like pieces of a story he wasn't sure he wanted to remember. But the truth of what had happened remained waiting patiently beneath the surface, ready to return the moment his strength did. And once it returned, it would change everything. Leonard Hayes remained in the hospital for 2 more days while the doctors monitored his recovery. The worst of the hypothermia had passed, but the weakness lingered in his muscles, and even simple movements required effort. Nurses came and went quietly, checking his temperature, adjusting the blankets, and bringing warm broth that tasted better than anything he had eaten in weeks. Outside the window, the city moved on without him, cars passing along the gray winter streets and people hurrying past with scarves wrapped tightly around their necks. The world continued as if nothing unusual had happened. For Leonard, however, the quiet hospital room had become a place where certain thoughts could no longer be ignored. The events of Christmas Eve replayed slowly in his mind, clearer each time. The dining table full of strangers. Emily's calm voice, suggesting he wait outside. The firm click of the door closing behind him. None of it felt like confusion anymore. It felt deliberate. On the morning of his second day, a social worker named Karen visited to discuss his discharge plans. She asked careful questions about his health, his medications, and whether he had family who could help him during the first few days at home. Leonard answered politely, explaining that he lived alone but had always managed well enough. Karen nodded and made notes on a clipboard before asking for the name of an emergency contact. Leonard hesitated for a moment before quietly giving Emily's name. The pause did not go unnoticed. Karen studied him for a second but chose not to ask further questions. Instead, she handed him a small folder containing information about follow-up appointments and local support services. When Leonard opened the folder later that afternoon, a printed financial summary slipped out among the papers. At first, he assumed it belonged to someone else, but when he looked closer, he realized the numbers were connected to his own account. The hospital's billing department had requested verification of his insurance and payment history, and the document included a list of recurring monthly transfers linked to his bank. The amounts were modest individually but consistent. $200 labeled home support, another payment covering a credit card balance, and several smaller transfers marked for maintenance expenses. Leonard stared at the page for a long time before recognizing the destination account attached to each transaction. They were all going to Emily and Daniel. Back at his apartment later that week, Leonard logged into his online banking account for the first time in months. The screen filled with a history of payments he had stopped noticing long ago. Mortgage assistance when Emily and Daniel first bought their house. Help with unexpected bills. Repairs, insurance, small emergencies that seemed temporary at the time. The transfers had started as occasional gestures of support but eventually became routine, automated, and quietly scheduled to leave his account every month. Leonard leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath as the realization settled into place. For years he had believed he was helping his daughter get through difficult times, the same way any parent would. But looking at the numbers now, he understood something else. The support had never truly stopped because it had never been meant to stop. It had simply become part of the arrangement. Emily had grown used to it, Daniel had certainly grown comfortable with it, and Leonard himself had allowed it to continue without questioning whether the help was still needed or appreciated. The porch on Christmas Eve suddenly looked different in his memory. It wasn't just a moment of thoughtless cruelty. It was the point where usefulness had ended. Leonard did not react with anger the way some people might have expected. Instead, he moved through the account settings carefully, one page at a time, canceling each automatic transfer with deliberate calm. The confirmation boxes appeared on the screen in neutral gray text. Are you sure you want to stop this recurring payment? Each time he selected yes. The process took less than 10 minutes, but when the final notification appeared, he felt something inside him loosen slightly, as if a weight he had been carrying without noticing had finally been set down. He closed the laptop and made himself a cup of tea, standing quietly in the kitchen while the kettle hummed on the stove. The apartment felt peaceful in a way he had not experienced for years. 2 days later, his phone rang while he was reading in the living room. Emily's name appeared on the screen. Leonard watched the phone vibrate against the table for several seconds before letting the call go unanswered. A message arrived shortly afterward. Dad, we need to talk. Something strange is happening with the bank transfers. Leonard read the message once, then set the phone aside. An hour later, another message appeared, this time from Daniel. Did you cancel the payments by mistake? The mortgage account says the deposit didn't come through. The tone carried more concern about finances than about Leonard's condition. Later that evening, Emily called again, leaving a voicemail that sounded increasingly irritated. We noticed the transfer stopped, she said. If you're upset about Christmas Eve, we can discuss it, but cutting things off like this isn't fair to the kids. Leonard listened to the message without reacting. There was no apology in her voice, no mention of the ambulance, the hospital, or the freezing night on the porch. The focus remained exactly where it had always been. The following morning, Leonard took a slow walk through the small park near his apartment. The winter air was cold but clear, and the sunlight reflected softly off the thin layer of snow covering the grass. Children played near the swings while a few elderly couples walked their dogs along the path. Leonard moved carefully but steadily, feeling stronger with each step. For the first time in many years, his thoughts felt unusually quiet. He was not rehearsing explanations or preparing to forgive someone who had never asked for forgiveness. He was simply observing the world around him. When he returned home, another message from Emily waited on his phone. The kids miss you, it read. Maybe you could come for dinner this weekend, and we can move past all this. Leonard studied the words for a moment before placing the phone face down on the table. The invitation sounded familiar, but something about it felt hollow now. It was not reconciliation she was offering. It was a return to the arrangement that had always existed. That evening, Leonard opened a small wooden box he kept on a shelf near the window. Inside were old photographs of Emily growing up, birthday parties, school events, family trips taken long before life had become complicated. He looked through them slowly, remembering the years when his role as a father had been simple and unquestioned. Those memories still mattered, and they always would. But they no longer defined what his life needed to look like now. Leonard returned the photographs to the box and closed the lid gently. Outside, the city lights flickered on as evening settled across the streets. The apartment was quiet, but the silence felt calm rather than lonely. When his phone buzzed once more on the table, Leonard didn't rush to check it. He finished washing his dishes first, dried his hands, and then glanced briefly at the screen. Another call from Emily. He allowed it to ring until it stopped. Later that night, Leonard turned off the lights in his apartment and sat for a while by the window, watching snow fall slowly across the empty street. The memory of the porch was still there, but it no longer carried the same sharp sting it once had. Instead, it felt like a moment of clarity, a night when something hidden had finally been revealed. He understood now that love should never require someone to stand in the cold, hoping a locked door might open. Some doors, once closed, were meant to remain that way. Leonard stood after a while and walked toward the bedroom, feeling a quiet sense of certainty settle into his thoughts. He had not gained an apology or restored a broken relationship. What he had gained was something quieter, but far more valuable, the freedom to stop chasing warmth from people who had never truly offered it. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.